Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 33, The Saxon Solution. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the new emir of al-Andalus raided Aquitaine, but he lacked enough resources for a full-scale invasion. Despite the raid, Charles continued to focus on expansion east into Avar territory, pausing the eastern campaign only to deal with a Saxon revolt. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire was dealing with a controversial issue, the worship of icons, basically religious images. Worried by unrest caused by the ban on icons, Empress Irene invited representatives from every Christian center to attend the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which decreed that people were permitted to worship icons. Several years later, the bishops of the Frankish kingdom held a synod in Frankfurt that dealt with a number of issues, including icons. Rejecting the Ecumenical Council held by the Eastern Empire, the synod declared that icons were images and images only. Finally, the strain of constant warfare had finally broken the Avars. The Khan was assassinated, and his successor became a Frankish vassal. Charles had become king of Frankia in 771, and he had greatly expanded the borders of the kingdom since then. The Lombards were defeated, and the ruling family was removed, but there was little resistance, probably because the Lombard nobility realized that most of them would keep their social status and lands, so why fight? A similar situation occurred in Bavaria. The Avars had basically dissolved under the pressure of a sustained series of invasions, but from what little we know, they were a loose confederation of tribes rather than a nation. They might have become a nation like the Lombards and the Visigoths in time, but they didn't have time. So some submitted and became vassals of Frankia, and others drifted to other lands. Saxony was the exception. Unlike the Bavarians and the Lombards, the Saxons were non-Christians and had no desire to become Christians. Unlike the semi-nomadic Avars, who lacked the cultural bonds needed to resist a foreign invader, the Saxons had fought hard for every piece of land. Most important, the Saxons lacked a single ruling family that could be threatened or bribed into submission. The Saxons were divided, or more accurately, had divided themselves into regional communities that elected their own leaders, probably drawn from the local nobility. These regional assemblies survived under Frankish rule, and few Franks settled in Saxony aside from the missionaries sent to oversee the non-optional conversion process. Still, Charles believed that the Saxons had been pacified. When he heard rumors of a revolt in 794, Charles marched in with an army. The direct approach seemed to have worked, and there was no revolt. However, the peace proved temporary since Saxon nobles failed to appear at an assembly the following year. Believing that it would be easier to overwhelm the Saxons if he had allies, Charles approached the Slavic Abderites who lived near eastern Saxony. This location was crucial since western Saxony had been crushed, so resistance was concentrated in eastern Saxony. The initial invasion was launched in 795, and it became clear that the Saxon uprising was not limited to a single region. It was widespread throughout Saxon territory. Realizing that a single invasion would not crush the revolt, Charles resolved to launch an invasion every year until there was peace, or at least no revolt. In 797, the Frankish army crossed Saxon territory until it reached the North Sea, near the border with the Frisian region of Frankia. Concluding that his Frisian subjects supported their Saxon neighbors, Charles took both Frisian and Saxon hostages. Finally, Charles spent the winter of 797 to 798 in eastern Saxony, and his army had to endure the Saxon winter as well, since he spread the army across the Saxon lands to ensure that the residents of every Saxon village understood that they were being occupied. Even so, resistance was fierce, and the Saxons defeated the Abderites in the spring of 798. The fighting was bloody, since several thousand Saxons died in the battle. Despite occasional victories, the Saxons were worn down by the endless fighting until they had been pacified by 799. It is important to point out that Charles had first invaded Saxon territory at the start of his reign, and he had finally pacified the Saxons. Well, the surviving Saxons, roughly 25 years later. Most of his younger soldiers would have been unable to remember a period before the Saxon Wars. The economic cost of the repeated campaigns must have been immense, and the human cost was probably horrific. There are no detailed records of the campaigns, but thousands of Saxons had died resisting the invaders, and they had killed many Frankish soldiers and abjurates. This time, Charles was determined to end the Saxons as a threat once and for all. Saxons were forcibly removed from their lands and sent as unpaid, unfree laborers to other parts of the kingdom, while Frankish soldiers were settled in Saxony, basically ethnic cleansing. Other parts of eastern Saxony were granted to the abjurates as payment for their help. Unpaid, unfree laborers sounds like slaves. Theoretically, Charles was opposed to slavery, but there was a booming trade in slaves taken from his eastern campaigns, even slaves that had accepted Christianity, since it was an extremely profitable trade. On large estates, as much as a third of the labor force might be slaves. The number of estates had increased as the Frankish borders had expanded. Unlike small family-owned farms, these estates could invest in better farm equipment and, more important, the slave labor needed to work the farms. While slaves were property and thus could be sold, the separation of husband and wife was discouraged, and it was forbidden to sell Christian slaves outside of the kingdom. Although the export of slaves was forbidden, it was perfectly acceptable to import slaves as long as they were pagan. Obviously, Christians captured during the Eastern campaigns were not imported into the kingdom had simply expanded into their homes. If they did not flee in time, well, then they became new residents of the kingdom and could become slaves. However, the slave trade was relatively small since landholders bought slaves to farm land, so the owner of a plot of land would more likely sell the slaves with the land as a package. Basically, they became serfs, a slight but significant progression at the time. Also, slaves were permitted to save money and could even own slaves. While slaves could purchase their freedom or receive their freedom from a kind master, they would usually receive a plot of land and the obligation to farm the land for their former owner. In fact, many free peasants were actually tenant farmers, but it is probably inaccurate to call them free. Residents of small villages who owned their land would be free, although they likely owned some labor to a local lord. However, tenant farmers on huge estates, whether royal or estates belonging to monasteries or lords, all owed a number of days of labor to the estate, where they would work alongside slaves. There was probably a difference in treatment between a free peasant and a slave, but they could not refuse the labor and they did not own their land. So the slave economy was evolving into the serf economy, an improvement, but not a major one. Admittedly, the range of economic opportunities was limited at the time, so this may have been an acceptable arrangement. However, tenant farmers could not leave an abusive landholder and switch to a better landholder or move to a new region which might have better opportunities. These estates ranged in size from a few dozen families to hundreds of families and probably specialized in production depending on which crops were most suitable for the region, although they were largely self-sufficient for the simple reason that transport networks were poor. New cities were developing at ports on the coast and rivers, but most of the growth was within the Frankish kingdom, where the forests were being cut down to make room for farms, which led to local market towns that might become cities in the future. Aside from the land farmed by the monks themselves, monasteries owned estates, often numerous estates, some far enough that the abbots wrote letters to the managers of the estates detailing their requirements. While some, possibly many abbots, were personally greedy, they needed the estates to be productive since the abbots had to feed their own monks, shelter pilgrims, and give charity to the poor. To be honest, those requirements were flexible. But the obligations to the crown were not flexible. The king and his very large entourage could be expected to stay at a monastery during his frequent travels, and they would consume huge amounts of food and drink. In addition, monasteries were required to arm and supply large numbers of cavalry and soldiers for the annual campaigns. If they failed to meet those obligations, someone else might receive those estates. These heavy obligations required careful planning because harvests could be destroyed by unpredictable weather. Since their estates were not always located next to each other, this planning involved the development of transportation networks, or more precisely, the improvement and modification of the existing transportation networks. Actually, the conquest of Frisia by Charles's grandfather and namesake Charles the Hammer had enabled the creation of a trading system connected to the North Sea, since the internal Frankish kingdom produced goods and Frisia had ports. In fact, monasteries would purchase warehouses and ports to make it easier to sell their produce and buy whatever goods they did not produce or could not purchase at local markets. Most tenant farmers were required to pay rent on their farms and goods, but the farmers located further away could pay money because it was simply cost prohibitive to transport enough goods to pay the rent, although the farmers probably had to struggle to gather the few silver coins required to pay their rent. Speaking of the limited availability of coins, trade required a stable currency, so Charles had announced a capitulary that focused on money. Only the crown could operate mints, thus reducing the number of mints from several hundred to less than 50, and the mints had to apply the same royal mint mark, ensuring that the coins would be accepted across the kingdom. Moreover, the new laws set a standard currency. A pound of silver was worth 20 shillings, and each shilling was equal to 12 pennies. Fortunately for the bank balance of the various monasteries, the need to feed Charles and his large entourage decreased as Charles became older. Once the annual campaign had been concluded, his preferred residence after 794 was Aachen because he enjoyed the spas. Charles stayed there for increasingly longer periods because he was getting older and long journeys were tiring. Actually, the town was growing since leading men of the kingdom built their own halls there to be more comfortable when they accompanied the king during his lengthy visits there. The palace complex was commissioned when Charles had become astonishingly wealthy by the simple process of removing the contents of the treasuries of the Lombards, Bavaria, and finally the Avars. Admittedly, a considerable amount of that treasure was distributed among his loyal followers in order to ensure that they remained loyal. Even so, Charles still possessed an astonishing wealth, so he decided to build his dream home, dream palace. The construction of the palace complex occupied 10 years. There were two main buildings, a church and the royal hall, which was a 2-story building with administrative offices on the first floor and a huge banquet hall with private rooms on top. The royal hall was very likely the largest stone structure on the Frankish side of the Alps, which explains the never-ending construction. To be fair, the enormous size was not mere vanity. The huge building was intended to impress foreign ambassadors and to hold the annual assemblies of his nobles. The church was beautiful, but had biblical scenes rather than images of Jesus of Nazareth or God, and his throne was in the church, making it clear that Charles saw himself as God's representative. A basilica was located between the church and the palace, which featured a statue of Theodoric the Ostrogoth. Yes, the same Theodoric who nearly became emperor of the Western Empire several centuries earlier. It is vital to stress that it is genuinely strange that Charles had placed a statue of Theodoric the Ostrogoth in his chapel rather than Clovis, the founder of the Franks, as a major power. Is capital an accurate description of Aachen? During the Merovingian period, Paris had served as a capital, but the Frankish kingdom was frequently divided between Nuestria and Austrasia, while Aquitaine gradually became independent. Under Charles, the kingdom had expanded north and east, so Aachen was located roughly in the center of the expanded kingdom. Basically, Aachen became Charles's capital, but it was unclear whether it would remain the capital after he died. Aside from several marriages, Charles had had numerous mistresses, so Aachen was filled with his children, overseen by his most recent wife Liutgard, even though she was the same age as the eldest child. In fact, his grandchildren were growing up alongside their younger aunts and uncles who were teenagers or adolescents. It must have been a loud palace. So, what was happening in Aquitaine? Despite the embarrassment of a large-scale raid from the other side of the Pyrenees, the Frankish army had remained in the east, and then Charles devoted years to the pacification of the Saxons. Still, Charles had little interest in permitting regular raids. Therefore, in 797, he ordered the establishment of the Spanish March, a series of fortifications that stretched across the Pyrenees from Aquitaine to Septimania. Moreover, King Louis of Aquitaine had become a teenager by then, so Charles instructed his son to expand the borders of the Frankish kingdom south into the Iberian Peninsula. To be clear, it is unlikely that Charles expected Louis to penetrate deep into al-Andalus, since he did not send his son a large army. Given the lack of an army, expansion south into the Iberian Peninsula seemed unlikely. However, the situation on the other side of the Pyrenees soon favored the Franks. The Christian kingdom of Asturia was the remnant of Visigoth Spain, but it was struggling to survive against the Emirate of Cordoba. As I mentioned last episode, a Muslim army had rampaged in the kingdom the same year that another Muslim army had raided Aquitaine. Asturia had been an easy target for the emirate because the kingdom was poor. The surviving Visigoths had been left alone by the Muslim invaders because the terrain was harsh, so its residents struggled to feed themselves. Since Asturia lacked the natural resources needed to pay for a large army, King Alfonso II knew that he needed a powerful ally. In 797, Alfonso sent gifts to Charles that seemed to imply a subordinate status, but the slight damage to the ego was worth military assistance. Why did Alfonso suddenly believe that the emirate was vulnerable? Probably because the emir was struggling with revolts by both of his great uncles and Toledo and Zaragoza. That sounds like a surprisingly large number of revolts. Therefore, a bit of context is necessary. Hisham had died on April 17, 796, but he had learned from the conflict over the succession at the beginning of his reign, since he named his son al-Hakam as his successor. Unfortunately, while the succession itself was smooth, Hakam soon became busy with family matters, namely his ambitious uncles. Learning of his brother's death, Suleiman had returned to the peninsula and attempted to attract enough support to overthrow his nephew. Although he never became a major threat, Hakam could not deal with his uncle because his other uncle, Abd Allah, had also revolted. Rather than compete with his older brother Suleiman, Abd Allah traveled north to Aachen to see if the Frankish king was interested in supporting a regime change. Charles undoubtedly wanted a regime change, but concluded that Abd Allah would not be able to accomplish a regime change. Aware that the emir had to deal with two separate revolts by uncles, as well as conflict with Toledo and Zaragoza, Alfonso had unsurprisingly seen an opportunity to expand Asturias' territory. To sum up, after decades of war, Charles had resolved to crush the Saxons once and for all. Several annual campaigns later, the Saxons had been pacified, but Charles was determined to prevent another revolt. So Saxons were deported to other parts of the kingdom, and their lands were given to Frankish soldiers. Aside from the campaigns against the Saxons, Charles had standardized the Frankish currency to improve trade within the kingdom. Despite his ruthless extermination of Saxon resistance, Charles appeared to be feeling his age, so he spent most of his time in the spas at Aachen, which was becoming the capital of the expanded kingdom. Still, Charles wanted to ensure that there were no more raids into Aquitaine, so he instructed his son Louis to push south into al-Andalus. Since Louis was not given an army, he was unlikely to gain much territory, but an opportunity soon appeared, and I will discuss that opportunity next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.